I shall move. Jessica, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you Jewish? Where does your interest in Jewish history come from? And in particular, where does your interest in Sephardic history come from?
Okay, no, well, thanks to David and Ton for inviting me, and for all of you all who, at least if you're in Europe, are spending your Sunday evenings listening to me talk, or if you're elsewhere in the world, some part of your Sunday listening to me. And it's really an honor to be asked to come and just chat, and to meet you all virtually and to listen or hear about what interests you. About myself, I am Jewish. I was raised in the Reform Jewish tradition. I think those of you all, especially in the United States, will know what that is. It doesn't really exist anymore as much in the Netherlands, where I'm based. I'm based in Leiden. I've lived in the Netherlands 20 years, but I'm American, so if you can hear my accent. I'm American by birth. I was born and raised in Kentucky, which is not really a mecca for Jews, you may be wondering, but my father was a professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University. His family and my mom's family were originally from Memphis, Tennessee. We're an Ashkenazi Jewish family. Kentucky, as many of you know, if you're at least from the US or familiar with the US, is really in the middle of the Bible Belt. We were one of about 6 or 7 Jewish families in Richmond, Kentucky, a town of about 25 or 30,000 people. We drove about 30 miles to the nearest synagogue, which was in Lexington, Kentucky. So I've always been, well, so that's my background. I've always been interested in religion, in history, and the intersection of religion and history. But I have to say I wasn't originally interested so much in Jewish history. But via a sort of strange set of circumstances, via Israel, actually, I ended up in Brazil when I finished college. I had gone to Israel to work on a kibbutz, was interested, I've been raised in this kind of secular Reform Jewish family, interested in learning more about Jewish history, Jewish culture, worked on a kibbutz in Israel. Met a Brazilian woman. We worked together. We became good friends. This is when I was in the middle of my college career. I wanted to travel when I finished my bachelor's degree. And she said, well, you can teach English in Brazil. You can live with my family. So I did. And when I was in Brazil, I taught English. I traveled around. And that was the first time I learned about the Jewish presence in Brazil, in Dutch Brazil, actually. And I became fascinated with the story. I'd always been interested in Latin America, and I became really fascinated with the story of Jews in Dutch Brazil, what happened to them. And that remained an interest of mine. I went ahead and did a master's degree in Latin American studies with a focus on history and literature. But then I thought, nah, I don't want to go on in academia. I come from an academic family. I know what it means to be an academic. I don't want to do that. I went traveling again, and then I met this Dutch guy in Irkutsk, Siberia. And well, the rest is history. We're still married. We've got an 18-year-old son. We've had 2 cats, dogs, everything. So I came to the Netherlands and eventually got a PhD position at the University of Leiden, and decided to pursue that interest that was originally in Dutch Brazil and Jews in Dutch Brazil, and then it became Jews in the Atlantic.
Thank you. Maybe you can take us through some of the topics that you researched in the past. Did you ever publish about Dutch Brazil, I wonder?
No, that's the really irony. That's what got me interested in this topic. But I've mentioned it in various published works, but I didn't end up publishing on Dutch Brazil. Although there's some great work on Jews in Dutch Brazil and Dutch Brazil in general. Now I've mostly published originally on trade. I started off with this very empirical, traditionally Dutch topic about looking at bills of exchange and bills of lading and how much sugar was coming here or there. And that's where I started. Still really interesting stuff. But as that work progressed, I became more and more interested in the cultural, the social side of things. Why were people choosing to trade with who they were choosing to trade with? Challenging some of this idea that kinship networks that people of the same ethnicity, in this case Sephardic Jews, were only trading with themselves. And then I got into topics of migration to what we might call intra-ethnic, intra-Jewish connections, how Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews were dealing with each other in the early mid-17th century, citizenship, settlement, enslaved people. So those are some of the things I've dealt with. And I should say I haven't only looked at Jewish history. A lot of my work has been on Caribbean history, on freedom, free people of color, women in the Caribbean. So I mixed that with my work on Jews.
You've also written about Dotar, the Amsterdam charity that doled out dowries to orphan girls and young ladies. What did that research tell you about the role of women in Sephardic environments? I know that's a very broad question, but...
Yeah, I think what it showed me is that actually, at least in that period, and that period's the early to mid 17th century, the role of women is not that much different than I think it would have been for other religious groups. And I'm thinking about actually not as much the work I did on the Dotar, but on some research I did on a very poor woman named Simha Gomez Suarez in Amsterdam. Her husband abandoned her. And that wasn't uncommon for either Sephardic Jewish women, Ashkenazi Jewish women, or just women full stop. Particularly in the Dutch Republic, women get abandoned. Men go off to make money, to travel for whatever reason, and they don't come back. Now, maybe they die, or maybe they just think, wow, it's a lot nicer here. And she was abandoned. She was dependent on communal charity. In the end, she's accused of having an affair. In the end, her husband had gone to Suriname. He makes contact with the congregation in Amsterdam and says, actually, my wife is bringing shame on the family. I want custody of my children. I want them shipped to me to Suriname. And eventually they were, which illustrates, the lack of power that women had, even though he'd abandoned the family, left her dependent on the communal coffers, on communal charity. He got the children as the father. And that, again, is not just the case for Sephardic Jewish women, it's Ashkenazi Jewish women, but women full stop in the early modern period. So I think, we have this tendency also to project the strong role of Jewish women has been talked about a lot in the historiography, whether Sephardic or Ashkenazi. But I think we tend to forget how many women lived in poverty. How they had to, and some of the work of Tirza Levy-Bernfeld has really illustrated that brilliantly. And in that sense, Jewish women, despite the fact that we think, yeah, the Jewish mom, and she's really strong, and, Jewish women control a kashrut, keeping kosher, and that gives them a really important role, sure. What we also shouldn't, but especially if you're poor as a woman, you don't really have a lot of power. And I think that's the other thing I want to say about Sephardic women, but also just women full stop in the early modern period is, and it's not surprising, the more wealth you have, the more status you have, the more power you have. We tend to look back and we see all these court cases of women and we think, oh yeah, they actually had a lot of power. Sure, if you have the money or the know-how to take something to court, but if you don't, you're in a bad position. So I don't think the role of Sephardic women is exceptionally exceptional for the time.
Yes. Well, Dotar gave away these dowries, and I understand that dowry was always for the woman. And if there was a divorce or if the husband died, the woman would at least have the dowry to live on or to help her survive for a time.
Absolutely. And it's a way, of course, to ensure some sort of equitable distribution of resources within a family, because it's always going to be the sons who are inheriting the family business. So it's a way of, or nephews, it's a way of ensuring some sort of distribution of the family's wealth, of ensuring that this daughter is not a burden on the family if the husband dies or she's left alone. The interesting thing also about the dotar, I should say, is it's also a way to get women to fairly far-flung places where there might be a shortage of women. If you look at the dotar records from the 17th, 18th century, you see requests for places like Essequibo, places that really fairly far-flung places, which show that women are going there. The requirement is that they're marrying a man in good standing with the community, a Sephardic, a Portuguese Jewish man. So it is a way to sort of encourage migration, and to ensure that women are that these families are continuing their legacy even in these far-flung places. Another last thing I should say is that, and you find this a lot in the Sephardic communities, at least in Amsterdam for sure, in Suriname, is that even girls whose mother is not Jewish can sometimes get, and this is especially in the early 17th century, can get a dowry via the dotar, which is, of course, in standard halakhic Judaism is passed via the mother, not the father. So it's a very interesting development, as I say, especially in the early 17th century, that girls whose mother, in one case, her mother's a Christian, had been a servant in the household, was able to receive a dowry.
Returning to the topic of Brazil, in 1654, the only Sephardim living on the American continents were in Brazil. But the Portuguese recaptured Dutch Brazil. All the Sephardim left. And in 1660, they were all over the place. Curaçao, Jamaica, Suriname, Barbados, New York, Pomeroon, and a few other places as well. How did that come about?
Well, sorry, I'm just thinking, I'm laughing. I don't know if anyone in the audience, and I can't see everyone, maybe during the chat time, if anyone's Brazilian or living in Brazil, you could confirm this. One thing that really surprised me when I was living and traveling in Brazil, especially in Recife and northeastern Brazil, the part that used to be Dutch Brazil, people would say, yeah, if the Dutch had just stayed, we'd be in great shape. That there's this historical memory that, yeah, if the Dutch had stayed, we'd be, part of the EU. It would be great now. Anyway, so I'm thinking of that apropos of staying or leaving Brazil. So no, there's also this pervasive idea or myth that the Jews who then left when Dutch Brazil returned to Portuguese rule, went directly to other places in the Atlantic world. Some work's been done on this. A very few did. The vast majority returned to Amsterdam or to other places in Europe, of those original settlers. There was discussion actually in places like Middelburg and the Dutch Republic, but also Leghorn. So basically, Jews left. Most of them returned someplace in Europe. A very few stayed in the Atlantic world, but that's very few. And they went and regrouped. They went back to Europe. They started thinking about what else they can do, recovering their fortunes. And some then returned, as you say, Tom, rightly, within 15 years back to the Atlantic. Others stayed in Europe, but whole new groups of Portuguese Sephardic Jews returned. So you say, well, okay, well, why? There's a fierce competition for settlers. If we're looking especially at the Dutch Republic, I mean, that's the Dutch Golden Age. You got Rembrandt, things are going really well in the Dutch Republic, and it's small. There's not that many people. I mean, who wants to leave and go die in the tropics? And if you're going to leave, don't go to these obscure places. Go to what was then the East Indies. I mean, they really had a hard time getting people to go. I mean, even I think the estimate is about a third or a half or 2/3, a huge number of the sailors on ships were from Scandinavia, from the German states. So there's just a chronic shortage of settlers, not only for the Dutch, but also for the English. I mean, they just can't get people. Meanwhile, let's remember that you can't be an openly practicing Jew in the Spanish or the Portuguese territories anymore, nor after the mid 17th century in the French colonies. So really, by the mid 17th century, about 1660, the only place you can be an openly practicing Jew is in the Dutch or the English colonies. And the English and the Dutch really, really need what they call actually seasoned settlers. So they want settlers who, one, are immune to some of the diseases and who know what they're doing. So they start this kind of competition to get settlers, to get Jewish settlers, by offering them, kind of having a little bidding war almost, and lots of Wim Klooster's and some really interesting work looking at all these legal documents about, what rights and privileges are we offering to Jews, or to any people, but this is particularly attractive to Jews, to come to our place, our places of doom, or places where you're likely to die, to come and settle there. And why do they want them? Of course, there's a competition for colonies. There's a competition for space. I mean, what was then called the Wild Coast, where what's now Suriname, French Guyana, but was then also Essequibo, Berbice, all these little colonies. I mean, the French, the English, the Dutch are fighting for these places where you're just going to die, these mosquito-ridden places, because they think, it's going to become the next place to become rich with sugar, and also to fight against the Spanish and Portuguese on the mainland of South America. So they start offering Jews what they call liberties, and far more liberties to be openly practicing Jews than you would have anywhere in Europe at the time. So that's how you end up, and I can go into the mechanisms more, but I don't know how interesting that is. And that's why you start ending up having these Jews and these Jewish settlements, and particularly strongly, of course, in Suriname and Curacao, but also in the English colonies. A lot of you are probably there listening to Stan's talk. So yeah, that's how it happens, that within a relatively short amount of time after the fall of this sort of great Dutch Brazil, you have Jews all over the Atlantic world.
Yes. In Holland, there's also a discussion going on about Johan Maurits of Nassau-Siegen, who was the Dutch governor in Brazil. He is famous in Brazil for being a tolerant governor and bringing welfare and wealth. But he was also into slavery in himself. He bought slaves, and the Maurits Huis, a famous museum in The Hague, is now starting to discuss that side of the man the museum is named after. So that's a nice development, I think, maybe a necessary development. Jews, wherever they went, they were always a minority, wherever they settled. And of course, that must have affected them, but how?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Ton, and I think it also depends on what you mean by minority. As the work of Wim Klooster has shown, in Curacao and Suriname, certainly Jews made up anywhere, depending on the time, from a third to a half of the white population. So if we're talking just in terms of population versus enslaved and free people of color, okay, just in terms of numbers, yes. But in terms of perhaps power and influence in these colonies, not necessarily a minority. And that's what's interesting also to compare with the Dutch colonies versus some of the English colonies, and the mechanisms, because, and again, this probably a lot of you were attending when Aviva was speaking about her brilliant new work, how she's shown that actually, particularly in Suriname, how much power Jews had as part of these rights and liberties that had been offered initially with settlement. So So minorities in terms of numbers, yes. Minorities in terms of not being part of the Dutch Reformed or Protestant Church, yes. Minority in terms of power, it's an interesting question. And in fact, I've done this in some work that I'm now revisiting. Have said, yeah, but yes, there are all these liberties and there's these rights, but there's all these incidents of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish incidents, and doesn't that show that the Jewish presence, that there were minorities, that the position there was insecure. And I've used examples from Curacao and from Suriname and from Jamaica. And I'm, especially for, of course, the cases I know the most about, which would be Curacao and Suriname, I'm revisiting that a little bit, because of course we know and this is the problem with archives problem. We know about things because they're written down. So they've come down to us in these archives, and that can skew our view of how things work, because, why are things written down? Why did they go to the island council? Why is there a court case? Because something's gone wrong. But we rarely hear when things are just kind of puttering along and going okay. So I'm revisiting this idea that Jews were just barely tolerated, and that I've written about, that they always had to assert their rights, that the rights were always threatened. So being a minority, I think there was some feelings of insecurity, of we have to keep asserting our rights, our right to belong. But I don't think it's, again, in the Dutch territories, nearly as strong as I once thought it was, as I've written that it was. I think that that in some ways, in Jews in Suriname and Curacao were the longest, the people who'd been there the longest. And you see particularly the community in Suriname, but also in Curacao, writing about that. We've been here 100 years, we've been here 200 years. We're the real people, we're the real settlers, versus you Dutch people or these other people who kind of keep coming in and out. So yeah, being a minority, it really depends on how you're defining minority.
Yes.
Can I just interject an audience question? Have you found sources for the names of those who didn't return to Amsterdam from Recife, those who went on to Barbados and Jamaica and Curacao?
There are, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but David, if you don't mind sending me the question, or the person who sent the question, or email, because there's an article somewhere, which I'm looking blankly at my bookcase, but those names are known, and I can look up that article. I don't mind sending it on.
That's kind. It's from David, who's in close contact with Tom and myself. So
okay,
just forward
great.
it and we'll share it. Great, thank you. So sorry to jump in.
No, not at all.
Okay. Then you have been recently appointed as professor in Jewish studies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. It's a university with a Protestant origin. It goes back to the 1880s, I believe, founded by the great Kuyper, Abraham Kuyper, who was not Jewish, if you would think that. And in the beginning, some of the professors, among them the son of Abraham Kuyper, were not against constraining the rights of Jewish citizens. So this was somewhere between 1880 and 1940. But in the Second World War, the attitude of the university was exemplary, and they resisted the Nazis and helped Jewish pupils where they could. But the pressure on them became so strong that they closed the university in 1943. Some professors went on teaching, but then as a subversive activity. I understand that Jewish studies, the field to which you have been appointed, has always been a wish of the Vrije Universiteit. but they only got around to establishing it just now. Why the delay?
Well, I'm not sure I can quite answer that because I'm, not paid enough to be in the university administration, unfortunately. Well, I'm thinking of your giving the history of the university because when the appointment was finalized, I was asked to come into the dean and write what they called a self-bailed something or the other stuk. So in Dutch, it's like a self-reflection piece. And I was like, okay, but what do you want with that? And I was talking to the dean about it, and he said, yeah, that's one of the legacies of the 19th century, where newly appointed, not just professors, but faculty were expected to explain basically how Protestant they were and how they could therefore then teach at this Protestant university and mold young minds in the proper Dutch Calvinist Protestant fashion. Now, the first person to break this was actually a Jew, and I forget his name, but he was being appointed to the medical faculty, and he just outright refused to, until then they had appointed Catholics and maybe even a few Jews who just sort of made something up, lied with this paper saying, oh yeah, Protestant, whatever. But he just refused to do it. And after that, the university changed its policy. So now, but this is still a legacy that you're supposed to reflect on your own beliefs and how they will affect how you teach and how you relate to your colleagues. As to why the Vrije Universiteit hasn't done, as I said, I actually don't know. I mean, they've had a long tradition, certainly, of theology and religion until pretty recently. One of the Protestant theological faculties was part of the Vrije Universiteit. So people who wanted to train to be, Dutch Reformed vicars, ministers would go there. That's now been separated. So they have a long tradition of what we call Hebrew Bible, of Hebrew textual analysis. And I think, and that's actually the case, and it's something I'd like to change in the Netherlands as a whole. Jewish studies is equated with Hebrew language studies and or textual rabbinics, those sorts of analyses, which of course feeds into this largely Protestant desire to understand the texts upon which their religion is based. And I would say, of course, it's also money. All the universities in the Netherlands are always crying for more money. Religion, philosophy, humanities in general have tended not to get a lot of funding. They don't tend to get a lot of students. But most recently for this chair, the University of Amsterdam, the Manasseh ben Israel Institute, and the Joods Historisch Museum, the Jewish Historical Museum, have come together to put it together with the Vrije Universiteit. Mm-hmm. So that's a long way of saying I don't really know, but money, and it's finally come together.
What will it be like to work in an environment where there's research into many different religions?
Yeah, well, that's actually pretty new at the Vrije Universiteit. And I should say, it's good you remind me of that, Tom. They've recently also appointed a professor of Buddhism and a professor of Hinduism and brought in some more people to teach Islam. So they are reorienting themselves away from, I'm not giving up their Protestant heritage, their focus on Protestant Christianity, Dutch Reform Christianity, but they're orienting also more towards what so-called world religions or non-Christian religions. So I'm really looking forward to it. Thus far, I just started the 1st of February. My colleagues have been really welcoming, really open. I mean, I will say that there were a few interviews in some of the Dutch Christian press with me. Lovely, nice. And a few of them, I said, well, I'm interested in talking with people from all backgrounds. I'm not interested in people trying to convert me. There's a strand of Christianity, of people hoping to convert, particularly Jews. I thought I'd been pretty clear in Dutch with that. ik wil niet bekeerd worden in Dutch, and that was in the article. But then I started not from my colleagues really, but from other people who read the article. My inbox started getting filled with people wanting to, invite me to their church and talk to me about their faith or something. But none of my colleagues, even the quite religious believing ones, have been anything other than welcoming and really looking forward to having someone looking beyond Hebrew, looking beyond textual stuff, but looking at Jewish culture and history.
You mentioned the Manasseh Ben Israel Institute. So they are also your employers, or how does it work?
No, my employer is just the Vrije Universiteit, but they help put together this construction for the funding for it. The Manasseh Ben Israel, most of you, if you're interested in enough to come on Sundays to listen to all these people like me talk, know who Manasseh Ben Israel was. And it's an institute that originally was part of the Royal Netherlands Academy for Research, KNAV in the Dutch abbreviation. And now it's sort of semi-independent under the auspices of the University of Amsterdam. And their role is to try to promote Jewish studies in the Netherlands. They used to have and hope to again get it reinstated a chair of Yiddish literature. Hopefully that can be reinstated probably at the University of Amsterdam. Putting on conferences, raising awareness of Jewish history and culture in the Netherlands.
And the Jewish Historical Museum. Will you be working closely with them?
Definitely. Great organization who, especially during these times when they can't be open to the public, or you should check their website if you all haven't, are really doing their best with online exhibitions. They do a lot. They're part of what they call the Jewish Cultural Quarter, which includes the Portuguese synagogue. If you haven't been to Amsterdam, and eventually come when you can visit all these places, the Jewish Cultural Quarter is a lovely place. It ties a lot of the Jewish heritage and history in Amsterdam together. So yes, definitely working closely with the Jewish Historical Museum. I've worked with them before on their Jews in the Caribbean exhibit. I think maybe even some of you in the audience, I know Ron Gomez-Caceres was helped out with that. And we hope to keep working closely together in the future. I've also talked, coincidentally, I worked with the new head of history at the Rijksmuseum, Valika Smulders, originally from Curaçao. If any of you all in the audience are from Curaçao and know Valika. So she's been putting together this wonderful exhibit on slavery in the Rijksmuseum, and she'd be interested in working together with me and the Jewish Historical Museum to do something on Jewish objects portraying Jews, something similar at the Rijksmuseum going forward in a couple of years. So that would be really exciting.
Speaking about the Jewish Historical Museum, our speaker next week will be Emil Schrijvers.
Oh, yes, Emil, head of it all. Yeah.
Yes, and he will talk about Jewish book culture in Amsterdam, and we are looking forward to that one as well. What will be the focus of your future work? Of course, it will be about Jewish history in general, including Ashkenazim. And I read that you are appointed to do Dutch Jewish history, but the international factor in Sephardic history means that you will have to pay attention to that international connection as well, I hope.
Of course, I mean, I think it's really hard. Well, I just don't even think it's a good way to do history, really, to only look at Dutch Jews or American Jews or whatever, you know, Polish Jews. Of course, we have as historians to limit ourselves in some way because you get overwhelmed, but Jews as a diaspora group haven't worked within the boundaries of nation states. When we look at Sephardic history, especially, you can't limit it to any one geographical space very well. So no, there's no way I'd only be limiting it to Dutch Jews or Jewry. I want to keep looking at well, really the themes or the topics I've been looking at so far. That's colonialism, that's empire, Jewish entanglement with other groups in, well, wherever, but particularly in colonial spaces, intra-ethnic relationships. And by that, I mean, you know, connections between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but also Mizrahi Jews, you know, how that works on the ground. And yeah, I mean, I started my scholarly life in the early modern period, which is roughly 1500 to 1800, but you know, people debate about that. And more recently, I've gotten into the 19th century. But I really love focusing between this period that falls between those two, the 1750 to 1850, when you see a lot of shifts and all sorts of things. So I'd like to keep working in that time period. So I have a few dream books to do that I'd love to do based on some great characters I found in the archive. Those of you in the audience, you must be a little interested in looking at archives and looking at history, and you know, you come across these fantastic characters, and you know, the sad thing as a historian, you can't always find out what happened to them. You get really involved in their stories, and then you just don't know what happened to them. So I've got a few characters out there that I really want to investigate further. I want to write more about women, enslaved people, Jews of color. You know, I've got a kind of some steamy adultery cases out there that I would think would be great to put in a book. When I finished my PhD, when I defended it, my son was 6, and then it was published a couple of years later and by Brill. And he said, "Mama, when are you going to write a book that people want to read?" And, you know, that's, you know, a little bit painful, but he's right. So I'd like to also in the future, you know, write books that people really want to read. Not that they're going to become bestsellers necessarily, but I'd like to write for a broader audience, still nonfiction, but more, quote, popular history, that brings these great stories, this great history to a wider audience.
We have a question actually, asking whether you could comment on the Jewish role in the transatlantic slave trade.
No.
I say some Jews. I mean, because like families like mine were living in abject poverty in Europe.
No, I can't comment. No, I'm just joking, of course. I can't imagine that it hasn't come up in all these conversations in the past on Sundays. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's such a hotly debated topic. And what I think is a shame is that and the whole subject of Jews, people of color, Blacks, tends to be framed in this very American, North American, US framed debate of conflict versus cooperation. And I think, you know, it misses a lot of the nuance of how relationships worked, of how things worked. And I think Aviva's most recent work on Suriname does a great job of nuancing that. So yeah, I mean, Jews in the transatlantic slave trade, I mean, what can you say? Of course, they participate. Everyone participates to some extent in it. You know, it gets into who's a Jew, are they of Jewish descent, are they new Christians, does it matter, you know, why, yeah, does it matter, what are you looking for when you're talking about that? And I'm not being flippant. I mean, we can discuss if, I don't know who's asking the question, wants to go into more detail. But yeah, Jews are involved in the transatlantic slave trade.
If perhaps I can just ask a personal question, because a member of my family who was later burnt alive by the Inquisition, he went through the whole thing of being born in Spain and being taken to Amsterdam and then going to Brazil, which is where he was arrested. And I started with the knowledge that he was burnt alive. And then as my Portuguese got a bit better, I realized that he was transporting enslaved people from Salvador to Minas Gerais. And one just wonders what's going on in people's heads where they have situations where their own, I mean, his parents appeared in the Madrid auto de fe of 1680. And I suppose it's just a different morality, but somehow that still doesn't sit comfortably. I don't know whether we can say that they should be held to the same moral standards that we have, or what. I mean, it's such a thorny subject. You must have thought a bit about it.
You know, I think it's something that comes up anyway, and it's something, I mean, I think about for those of you in the audience who are Jewish. You know, we have Passover, Pesach coming up, and as I mentioned, I'm, you know, grew up in the Reformed tradition. It's a shame my Haggadahs are upstairs, with this very social justice Haggadah that we still use every year, although the new editions, instead of the edition we had as a child, despite the social justice emphasis, had God our Father, and the newest editions I've gotten as my own Seder has expanded, has, you know, God of our forefather, of our ancestors. So it's, you know, non-gendered language. So it's still developed. But anyway, this is all apropos of if you sit down, if you're Jewish, or if you've been to a Passover, a Pesach Seder, we're talking about celebrating the Exodus from Egypt, of being released from slavery.
Exactly.
That's a core tenet of what we celebrate. So also my favorite holiday because of its historical element, and the food and wine too. So then, yeah, I think it's really hard, as you say, David. How can we sit down? We're sitting there, we're going through our redemption from slavery. How can then Jews have been involved in this? How were they not, you know, what sort of cognitive dissonance was going on there? I can't answer. I mean, I can say that I think Natalie Zeman Davis wrote about this. You know, some Haggadahs from the 18th century, from, you know, the preeminent Jewish plantation slave colony of Suriname. You know, there are Haggadahs, but, or maybe it's Jonathan Schorsch. I'm again looking at my bookcase where answers are not going to be found because I'm not going to pull out the book. I think it was actually Jonathan Schorsch. If you don't know his book about Jews and Blacks and the, you all should read it. Shows that this Haggadah, you know, really minimizes aspects of slavery and plays up, you know, God choosing the people of Israel. So I think, and there's a whole actually industry of people studying Haggadahs from different places and spaces and times, and what is emphasized in this central core tenet story. But that's just to illustrate that, hey, you know, where Jews are owning plantations and owning enslaved people, they're downplaying that aspect of that story. And there is that cognitive dissonance. And I think it is very hard for us now to say, yeah, but how, come on. But they did. I don't know if I have better answers for that.
I suppose also there is a further context that, of course, Europeans were also being enslaved during this period by Barbary pirates, probably again including sort of some Jewish merchants in Saleh and places like
actually,
that.
I've come across records, and Ton probably knows them far better than I do, of you know, collections to free Jews who've been captured by the Barbary pirates, and you know, they also do it for Christians. I mean, of course, you know, that's especially in the US, people who want to downplay the historical legacies of slavery start talking about, yeah, but Europeans were slaves too, and actually the Irish were slaves too. And that's a rhetoric and a narrative to downplay the enormity of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, no, I just.
I'm not saying you're doing that.
There's a context. There is a context. Funnily
No,
enough,
I'm not saying you're doing that,
I
David,
have
at all.
the mitzvah of the Parnas de Cautivos in
Exactly.
my,
But yeah, I think there is this cognitive dissonance, and everyone's doing it, and it's not considered a sin in any way. And actually, when we're talking about this whole issue of the Jews and the transatlantic slave trade, as a lot of you all know, this really becomes debated or comes to light via the Nation of Islam and their writings. And they got people to read in Portuguese, and they got people, but they use a lot of actually Jewish historians who are writing about this in the 30s, particularly the 1930s, because for them it's showing the contributions of Jews to the societies they were living in, particularly the Netherlands and England or Great Britain. Like, hey, look how much we contributed, look how much Jews have contributed to the economy at this vital part of these nations' histories. And then that becomes misused later by the Nation of Islam to say, yeah, look how much they were involved in the slave trade. And that's just showing, even for a lot of the 20th century, it was considered almost a positive thing because you had contributed to the economy in the past.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question, which I'll slightly boulderize, but was it better to be a Jew in Dutch or English territory?
Ooh, well, I'm a little biased. I think the Dutch, though, definitely.
Okay.
And that's why I was talking a bit about before with the minoritization. Jews just have a bigger presence. They are less insecure or far more secure in the Dutch territories. So I think it's better. Yeah.
Okay. I calculated once, not very scientifically, because hard numbers are hard to get, that the number of Sephardim in the 17th and 18th century at any given point in time in those centuries was not much larger than 30,000. Yet it seems that they attract a lot of interest from historians and from lay people. Were they more important than that number indicates?
The Sephardim are great propagandists. They're great at tooting their own horn, as we say in America. They're great, and you see this already in the late 17th century of creating a myth of themselves. And Aviva writes about this a bit in her new book. I saw it also when I was looking in the archives in Curacao. They create these things called memorias, sort of stories of their own communities, and then they keep referring back to those in the self-referential way to show, how long they've been in places, how important they've been. It's also actually practically like, see, we had this right then, so you can't take that away from us now. But they're really great at creating, also in Amsterdam and Hamburg and London, this image of wealth, of culture, of refinement, of drawing upon these ideas of the Spanish Golden Age, of theater, of art. Like they're great at drawing these strands together and creating this image of themselves, which actually isn't true. I mean, it's, as I mentioned earlier this evening, Tirza Levy-Berenfeld's fantastic work about poverty in the Amsterdam Jewish community. I mean, they're really poor. They're really poor. That's why they're sending their poor away, as most of you have heard about the despachados, not only from Amsterdam, but other places. I mean, there's this circuit of poor Jews that are getting sent around and around from London to Amsterdam, to Hamburg, to Suriname, to Barbados, to wherever, because there's just a lot of poor people, a lot of poor Sephardic Jews, and these communities are trying to send them away, not only because they can't support them, but because it's bad for their image. And that's one reason as well that the Sephardic community in Amsterdam, when Ashkenazi Jews really start coming as refugees, and Joseph Kaplan writes a lot about this too, in the 1630s, 1640s, they don't want them there because they're really afraid of and this is kind of true, that, you know, for Dutch Protestant society, Christian society, they're just going to see a mass of Jews and not be able to differentiate between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. And they think the Ashkenazi are particularly embarrassing because, you know, they're really uncultured, they're really poor. You know, we don't want them at all, and we don't want to be associated with them. So all this to say, they're just great at self-promotion and propaganda. How important they are? Well, yeah, it really kind of depends on what you're studying. They're very important at this very seminal period of Western European history. And I think maybe that, Ton, is why they're possibly disproportionately studied or talked about, because they are disproportionately there at things like the transatlantic slave trade, you know, sugar, colonization in the Americas, you know, financing things in England. They're disproportionately present. So I think that does skew our view. I mean, but also let's not forget, and, you know, my area of focus has been really on the Western Sephardic diaspora, but I know you all have had a few people coming in to talk, and I'm glad there's a lot more being written now in English about Sephardim in particularly the Ottoman Empire, because we tend to forget a lot about, wow, there's this whole community that is also there doing really, really interesting stuff. And pretty important stuff, just not over here in the Atlantic or in Western Europe.
Can I speak up for my my nation, the Nação Portuguesa? Because I mean, wouldn't it be fair to say that perhaps we were the first modern community? I mean, few in number, but you know, one that starts to see this post medieval sort of religious centered world, and perhaps also we could say that we were the first globalized population, or is that premature or unfair or just arrogant? I mean, I will confess that the arrogance does seem to be a Western Sephardic trait. But,
yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, David, because it's tying into, you know, it's an ongoing debate in sort of Jewish history anyway about, you know, what is modernization, and I think, yeah, what does it mean to be modern as a Jew or as anyone? I don't know. I mean, I definitely, one reason I love, well, I just think there's a reason I've chosen to study this group of people, even though I'm just one of these poor Ashkenazi people from Eastern Europe, because, you know, they're really boring, and they're just, you know, from some shtetl somewhere, and their food's kind of bad, and, you know, they're just boring. Like the Sephardim, I've bought into the propaganda or the image, right? Yeah, I mean, I like what you're saying, David, as this rebellion against this idea that Jewish modernity really happens in late 18th century, coming from German-speaking lands. And they're the ones who lead Jews into enlightenment, and that's sort of a top-down thing, or enlightenment and modernity. I don't know, because I don't know, you could have all these counterexamples, and I think Spinoza's used as the biggest one. You know, this one thinker, but then, you know, he gets banned, and there's other ones. You know, there's a pretty strong back and forth between communal religious authority and people pushing, Sephardic Jews pushing against it. And that's really the Western one. In terms of global, sure, but what is global? Because I just mentioned this Sephardic, yeah, again, you've had speakers, I think, in the Ottoman territories, they have relatively little contact with each other. So, I mean, how global are even the Sephardim? If there's very little contact with other Sephardic Jews in the Balkans or in other parts of the Ottoman territory. I mean, what does it mean to be global? So well, I'm saying I don't.
The Nação Portuguesa, not these sort of Levantines or whoever else. But I mean, global in terms of, you know, people were in Africa, in the Americas, in India, in China, in Japan. Okay, not very many, but you can start to see the emergence of the world that we now inhabit is what I'm thinking. I mean, maybe it's just hubris. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a group of people who travel a lot. But yeah, I think it's a matter of what does that mean. If you have, Uncle so-and-so who's sort of sometimes based here or there in a port city, does that make it global? I mean, is geographical location all that is meant by being a global group? I mean, it can be, sure. And then, the Sephardic Jewish traders, at least all over, more so than any other group, certainly more so than any other Jewish group. What does that mean for mentality, for the Jewish practice, for modernity? I don't know. I think it's a really good question. But I'm always a little wary of saying, just because you have Uncle so-and-so in Madeira and, someone else over here, it meant something enormous. It meant something about an entire mentality. It may have, but we just don't know.
Well, maybe I'm guilty of the self-aggrandizement you were discussing earlier.
Well, I mean, I've spent my career studying it, so this propaganda has really been very effective.
Tirza Levi Berenfeld says somewhere in her excellent book about Sephardic poor in Amsterdam that the Mahamat in Amsterdam had correspondents all over the world, and they corresponded with everyone, and they knew what was happening in New York, in Newport, on Barbados, in Suriname, on Curaçao, in Constantinople. This was an existing network with letters going back and forth. I think there's something to say for David's.
No, absolutely, but that's not, to be frank, that different than, for instance, Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, you have the people. I mean, you've got, and that's part of being part of a global diaspora group, for instance, particularly in philanthropy and charity. I mean, you've got the people traveling all over begging for money for the poor in the Holy Land. You've had that with Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews for, millennia, basically. You have correspondence about, all sorts of things amongst groups, also between Ashkenazi and Sephardim, that people correspond, that Jews correspond with each other across the diaspora is not new. It really isn't. Now, the fact that the Western Sephardi diaspora is so far flung means, okay, that's extended, sure, but that people are keeping in touch with each other, that's not unique to the Western Sephardi diaspora. But it is really cool to study, for sure.
I'm skipping a few questions here to give our viewers the chance to put their questions to you. But one last question for me. Who do you admire in your field of work, especially with regard to Sephardic studies?
Yeah, gosh, who don't I admire? Yeah, well, I've already mentioned Aviva Ben-Ur, who's doing amazing work. I've mentioned Tirza Levi Bernfeld, also just amazing historians. I think you've had Laura Arnold Liebman talk, fantastic scholar. I've mentioned Wim Klooster's work. He's not really working specifically on Jews that much anymore, but he's the one who really got us a lot of the empirical data we have, especially on the Dutch colonies. Sarah Stein at UCLA has done just great work, not just about Sephardic Jews, but Jews in North Africa, the Middle East, talking about these issues of global diaspora. Francesco Trivellata, Sina Rauschenbach, Jonathan Schwarz. And I've mentioned the Ottoman Empire a few times because I think people like Julia Phillips-Cohen, who look at Jews' citizenship in the Ottoman Empire, how Jews dealt as being a part of a minority, getting back to that earlier question, is great. well, and I should say people who don't have the luxury of working at universities as researchers, but people like you, Tone, or Ron Gomez Caceres, or other people who just, out of their passion for the topic, spend their free time in the archives researching stuff, publishing about stuff, talking about stuff to groups. I really admire that, because I know, wow, if I weren't, I hope I'd still keep doing it because I love it enough, but I know how hard it is if you have other demands on your time, and you don't have an institutional structure around you to just kind of keep on going to the archives, keep on looking at stuff. So yeah, there's just a lot of great work coming out, and I'm really happy. And I've mentioned briefly before that in Jewish studies writ large, there's been a real bias, and this is especially in the Anglo-American Academy, of looking at Eastern European Jews, looking at Ashkenazi Jews, looking at 19th and particularly 20th century, looking at everything through the American or the British lens. And Sephardim, whether Western or Eastern or Mizrahi Jews, have been left out of that conversation a lot. And I think it's just great. I've mentioned just some people off the top of my head. There's a lot more fantastic scholars that finally, whether, as David's saying, as part of this idea of the global diaspora, in whatever way they're viewed, that quote, other Jews, as in non-Ashkenazi Jews, are being finally part of being taken up as part of the mainstream larger narrative of Jewish history.
Thank you. David has been looking at chat, I hope.
Well,
yes, sorry,
not as much as I should have been. Kevin, who is one of us, is asking why you're interested in the Sephardim if you're not implicit, if you're not like falling at your feet worshipping us.
But I mean, I love the Sephardim. I mean, I said, I'm of Ashkenazi descent myself. The food's bad. The history's already been studied pretty extensively. Yeah, why wouldn't I want to study the Sephardim?
Western Sephardic food. We don't really have any Western Sephardic food anymore. I mean, that's pretty bad.
No.
It's just what are there any sort of archival sources that you think we should be sort of digging around in that we are not? I mean, obviously there's a lot of work now happening with the Amsterdam Notarial Archives, but in your sort of travels around academia, is there anywhere that you think we should be looking that not enough people are?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I don't know where people are looking. I know where I'm looking. I mean, I can give a big plug for the growing digitalization of newspapers, even very early newspapers. I think for people out there who may have trouble just getting to the archives or reading, sometimes handwriting, the paleography can be really tough. The growing digitization, and I can even send links later of newspapers, because you've got newspapers that are now digitized online already to the 17th century in some cases. And not all the search engines are great. They're trying to get better as the technology has improved. But if you're not looking at newspapers, you really should think about it, because you can learn a huge amount. I'm trying to think of I imagine people are already looking at birth and death registers, marriage registers, standard genealogical things. And yeah, I was really sorry to have missed last week's talk about the Alliance, because I would have said, oh, look at the Alliance, especially for a later period, for the 19th century.
There's a lot of
ask me more questions and I'll probably come up with something. Yeah.
So can I sorry, one other question, and this is unfair because it relates to your earlier studies, but in terms of the sort of transatlantic trade in which Sephardim were involved, what are the commodities we're talking about? Are we just sort of talking about sort of sugar and tobacco, or other things as well?
I mean, sugar's the at least the main one that I looked at. But of course, I mean, one of the things I wrote about that gets forgotten because there's this idea that the Sephardim were really mostly involved in so-called colonial trade, is actually, especially Sephardim based in Amsterdam and Hamburg, were really involved in the Baltic trade, and within the Dutch historical tradition that's called the so-called mother trade, because that's the one that really, it wasn't as sexy as sugar and slaves and cacao and all these, you know, tropical goods, colonial goods, but it's the one that's being viewed as the driving force behind the wealth of the Dutch Golden Age. And that's mostly timber, but tar, other products from the Baltic. And actually the Sephardim in Amsterdam and Hamburg were quite involved in that trade.
And that's to sort of Danzig or to any ports in particular?
Yeah, that's mainly Danzig, but also, yeah, Hamburg to Amsterdam, also other smaller ports throughout the Baltic. So yeah, I mean, it's not as visible, it's not kind of as cool as looking at bringing, you know, spices and gems in. That's another one, gems from India, particularly even things like feathers. So in that sense, Sephardic traders are no different than any other traders at the time, although they have broader networks usually, David, so don't worry. They're still a bit exceptional, but they're involved in all those. But we shouldn't forget that they're also involved in the quite mundane, boring trade, but, you know, mundane tar and timber.
Somebody was asking a question if sorry, it went past really quickly, if you knew of any Sephardic involvement in the precious metal trades with Spanish colonies.
I don't. Let's see, I'm trying to think. No, I don't. It wouldn't surprise me, but especially, you know, the silver fleets. Yeah, that tends to be, or it's meant to be, centralized. Now it could be, especially new Christians were involved, but no, I don't know off the top of my head. It wouldn't surprise me though.
Okay, Ton.
There's a question from David Silvera. Did Jews of Amsterdam have an easier time of moving to Suriname and Curaçao as opposed to British colonies, and vice versa? Did those from England have an easier time going to Jamaica, America, Canada, and Barbados?
Yeah, it depends on the time period, really, because, yeah, it really depends on the time period, because at the time, especially Curaçao and Suriname are being governed not really in the same way we think of as a colonies governed from the metropole. You know, Suriname is partly owned by a family, or controlled by a family, partly by the city of Amsterdam. So it's not until later that it becomes more centralized. This belongs to the Netherlands, or this belongs to Great Britain, and therefore you need to be a citizen in some way. So in the 17th century, it doesn't, from what I've seen, it doesn't really matter. They're looking very much toward to have colonists. And in fact, when Suriname is actually, well, traded to, well, it's contested between England and the Dutch Republic. You know, they really want to keep the Jews there because they need settlers. So yeah, in the 17th century, I think it doesn't matter. I think probably at the latter part of the 18th century, it begins.
They did a lot of island hopping,
yeah.
I believe.
Yeah, definitely.
Kevin Martin mentioned the book The Grandees, published in the 70s.
Yeah.
Personally, I didn't like that book. I found it condescending towards Sephardim. He writes with a tongue in cheek, but not in a very pleasant way. And this doesn't seem to be able to distinguish between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. But maybe you have a better image of that book.
No, I mean, I think I agree, Tom. I think I'm happy that the book came out because it was the first, or one of the first, I think, that at least in the Anglo-American tradition sort of brought to the mainstream. It's still, it's not a New York Times bestseller or something, but it brought the idea of the Sephardic history more to the forefront, more to the fore. So I admire it for that reason mainly. Like, hey, wow, there's these, it's not just immigrants from Poland coming in 1890 and following this American trajectory of, quote, assimilation. So I'm really, in that sense, think it's an important book.
A question from David Simon. When did the USA become the location of choice in the Americas? Was it after independence? Or was it after it became clear the country was growing and had huge potential, 19th century?
Sorry, Tony, you broke up during the first part of the question.
When did the USA become the location of choice in the Americas?
Yeah, so that's really mid-19th century. And that becomes very hard for, I say as an American, for a lot of Americans, also people who study Jewish American history, to believe, they don't want to believe that the Caribbean was actually the center of Jewish life in the Americas until about the mid-19th century, maybe early to mid-19th century. Yeah, people don't, especially Americans, don't want to believe that. They don't want to look at places like Suriname or Jamaica or other places as being centers of Jewry, not just population wise, but in terms of knowledge. So yeah, it's only when you start really getting this influx of immigration around the mid-19th century, and then that really intensifies by the latter 19th century, that does it become the real place of choice. And that's a different kind of immigration. That's that mass immigration from Eastern Europe.
There's a remark by Ainsley Henriques. I'm happy that he is with us. Welcome, Ainsley. And he mentions the work by the late Elie Faber on Jews and the British slave trade.
Here it is.
You have, of course. Yeah, it's a good mention.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I really appreciate, I mean, obviously I have it. I think it's a shame that he felt like he had to write it, and that, this debate, and that came up earlier in our conversation about Jews and the transatlantic slave trade, became so heated, became so polemicized that, he felt that he had to write it. I mean, you don't really, or at least you didn't see, the Dutch and the slave trade or something like that, that there was even that need for an excellent scholar like that to write a book only addressing it. And yeah, I believe it's mostly about the English colonies as well.
Okay, so thank you, Jessica, for being with us. And
Thanks
I
for
think
the invitation.
it's time to have an ending. We have been going for 5/4 of an hour. And David, can you wrap it up?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I was asking some inane questions.
Absolutely not.
And we very much hope that you can come back and speak to us again on whatever you will be researching in the future.
I'd love to.
And after this meeting, Tom will send you a link and we can have a quick chat. Thank you to everybody who joined us today, and especially thank you to our patrons who keep the show on the road. And our speaker next week, Ton, your Dutch is better than me. Do you want to remind me of the name?
Speaker next week will be Emil Schrijver, and he will talk about Jewish book culture in Amsterdam.
That's brilliant. So thank you to everybody, and we very much look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you to Jessica, and congratulations
Thank you all.
on your appointment at the university.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night, everyone. Bye-bye.